Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this presentation. It's produced by Supporters Direct and by Rovers Trust, which is the Supporters Trust for Blackburn Rovers. My name is Michael Doherty. I'm a board member of Rovers Trust and I'm the Policy and Legal Officer. In my day job, I'm a Principal Lecturer in Law at Lancashire Law School, where I specialise in public law and constitutional law. This helps a little bit in relation to assets of community value. They are quite curious legal instruments. They are primarily in the field of property law, but they also involve administrative law and public interest law. Needless to say, this presentation doesn't constitute direct legal advice. The aims of the presentation now are really twofold. So first of all, to briefly sketch out the background to assets of community value, to touch on the main implications for football so far, which have been primarily relating to football grounds themselves, but secondly, and perhaps more importantly, to explore their potential use in relation to football training grounds, to provide information on the applications so far, some practical tips on making applications and some potential pitfalls, and generally to provide some food for thought on whether, as a Supporters Trust, this is something that you should be considering for yourself. So in relation to the background to assets of community value, the particular problem or mischief that they were supposed to address was the sale without notice of assets which were valued by the community. As the little picture shows, the typical example given was a local village pub, the only place in the village where people had an opportunity to mix and meet together, and they would wake up one morning to find out that it had been sold. Other sorts of examples given in the white paper that preceded the legislation were things like local libraries, community playing fields, and so forth. So the Localism Act in 2011 introduced a community right to bid for assets of community value. The objectives really were to allow community groups in advance to nominate assets that they regarded as being of community value, and for local authorities to list those assets. It allowed, at the point of a potential sale, it gave community groups notice of that intended sale and gave them time to put together a bid for those assets. Interesting to note the real limitations on ACVs, which is that there's no compulsion on owners to sell to the community group or accept the community bid, even if it happens to be the highest bid. So there are some clear benefits to the ACV scheme. If an application is accepted by a local authority, then the asset is publicly listed on the website as being an asset of community value, and it also has to be registered at the land registry as a land charge. If the owner does decide to sell, they must inform the local authority in writing, and they cannot proceed straight away to sale or disposal of the asset. The local authority must then publicise the intended sale. That triggers a 6-week period, which is an initial moratorium. During that time, a community interest group can make a written request to be treated as a potential bidder. They do so, then that triggers the full moratorium, which is a 6-month period during which the asset cannot be sold or otherwise disposed of. This therefore is a right to bid. At the end of 6 months, the community group will hopefully have gathered sufficient resources to be a serious bidder. In practice, it's rare for bids to succeed or even to be made. What's happened since 2011, we've seen the real value of the ACV scheme, and it's more of a prophylactic effect really on quick and secret sales. It gives community groups the ability to mobilise support and pressure to prevent a disposal that would take the asset out of community use, which is a point to bear in mind as we turn to see their use within football. At the time that ACVs were introduced in 2011, there was no mention of their potential use in relation to footballing assets. But nevertheless, applications to list football grounds have been widespread and have been successful. The first batch of successful applications occurred in 2013, including of Ewood Park, home of Blackburn Rovers, by my predecessors at Rovers Trust. And other grounds listed in that year were Old Trafford, Anfield, and the Valley. There is no national definitive list of football grounds that have been listed as assets of community value. The best list is probably from Supporters Direct, and as of 2018 there were 37 league and non-league grounds which were listed. Some of the things that have helped in that process is that football stadium have been accepted as being property which does further the social well-being or social interests of the local community, which is the key criteria. It's the real acid test as to whether a particular piece of property is an asset of community value. And also that supporters trusts have been accepted as groups which are a voluntary or community body with a local connection. In my first draft of this, I did have a slide on the process and criteria for making an application generally, but I've decided to keep my advice very, very simple and very unambiguous on this. That if you're a supporters trust and you don't currently have an ACV over your club's football ground, then simply get one. And the best way to do that is to contact your business contact at Supporters Direct, who can guide you through the process. For football grounds themselves, it's become pretty straightforward to get an ACV listing. The more difficult question is whether you can or should attempt to protect the other assets of your club, and in particular the training ground. So this slide does have three contrasting stories, but it's important to say at the outset why this is important. It's important because when clubs fall into financial difficulties, as many clubs do, they will look to certainly to sweat the assets and if necessary to unload assets so as to balance the books. These sorts of decisions really are made to prioritise the short-term financial interests of the owners rather than the long-term interests of the club and the supporters. The key function of supporters trusts is to act to defend those long-term interests, to protect the infrastructure of their clubs. As we've seen from previous slides, ACV listing is a modest protection, but it does provide a rare opportunity for community bodies like supporters trusts to intervene over property that they do not themselves own to provide some sort of protection. And these sorts of concerns aren't hypothetical, and these sorts of possibilities from ACVs also aren't hypothetical, as we can see. The first story relates to Bolton Wanderers, who in February 2016 announced the sale of their training ground in the village of Exton in Lancashire. This had been their first team training ground and their main base for backroom staff for the previous 15 years. But because of the well-recorded financial difficulties that Bolton Wanderers were facing at the time, they sold that training ground to Wigan Athletic, who now use it as their main training facility for the first team. Bolton Wanderers did have somewhere else to go, but they've had to resort to using their academy training ground as their main training ground now. And as a solution, this is clearly, what's the term now, suboptimal. They've had to install an inflatable dome so that they can do indoor training. They've had to do that to retain their Category 2 status as an academy. An awful lot of this has had to be paid for by half-time lottery fundings and so forth. So the dangers are real, that when clubs get into financial difficulties, they will look to offload what should be part of the long-term infrastructure of the club. The second story relates to Derby County Football Club, an application by the Supporters Trust, the Rams Trust, over the training ground at Moorthorne Training Centre. This was a successful ACV application over a training ground. It took place as early as July 2014. One of the real keys for the success of this application was that Derby County had submitted a planning application to extend the site of the training ground in January 2014, which following the report of a planning inspector had been approved. As part of that application, the club had really emphasised how central the academy and the training ground was to building a sustainable football club. This had been confirmed by all the relevant local authorities who emphasised the overriding national, regional and local need for a training centre and its role in the local and regional community. The third story relates to an application that I was involved with, an application from Rovers Trust in relation to the Blackburn Rovers Senior Training Ground and Academy at Brockhall. We had no similar planning application to provide useful ammunition for our application, and there was really significant pushback from the club opposing our application, in particular from the specialist lawyers. And our application was rejected by the local authority in October 2017. So there is a potential role here for supporters trusts, but we may not always be successful. So here's some advice on how to prepare for the application, how to research it. Really the starting point should be an ACV application of your football stadium. This will give you experience on how ACV applications work. If you've already done it, then within your trust you will already have some expertise, and as I've said, you can access support and guidance from Supporters Direct. It's important, first of all, to do some research on the legal status of the land upon which the training ground lies. You'll need to state whether the land is held on a freehold basis or a leasehold basis. You need to state who the owners are, the particular corporate entity who own the land or the lease. And you can apply to the land registry for this. You can obtain ownership details, but you should also try and get a copy of the lease or the deeds, which may uncover more useful information. Secondly, there's no central form for making ACV applications, and each local authority has its own form. So it's important to download that and familiarise yourself with the structure so that you can plan your research to address the particular structure of that particular form. And thirdly, you need to think about the level of supporter involvement. It's important to remember that an ACV application is really quite different from a planning issue. For planning, the tactics for supporters trusts are really very clear. We need to mobilise. So mobilising means petitions and supporters letters, getting councillors involved, lobbying the planning committee, etc. ACVs are different because planning lies really at the boundary of legal and political decision making, whereas ACVs are much more clearly legal. The decisions were made by a local authority legal officer applying a legal test. However, without getting too jurisprudential, legal decisions are never entirely free of political factors. That's particularly the case when you've got a local authority legal officer making decisions within the structures of a democratic organisation like a local authority. But secondly, part of the practical benefit of making an ACV application over a training ground is showing your supporters base that as a trust you are being active, creative, etc. So the way in which we did that with our Rovers Trust application was that we included the names and addresses of our trust members who lived in that particular local authority area and who had expressly agreed to support our application. Legally, we made this relevant aspect of the application by stressing the idea of community value, that these were members and local residents who were stressing the value that they placed on the training ground as part of their local community. At the heart of your application now is going to be this question of community benefit. And I think there are two elements to this in relation to applications for football training grounds. Firstly, that the training ground stroke academy is an integral part of the football club, and secondly, to highlight all sorts of examples of direct use of that facility by the community. So firstly, the integral part. This is pretty easy to argue. It's pretty easy to argue that the football club itself provides community benefit. It can be a little bit more difficult to establish that the training ground is integral to that benefit of the football club. Without sounding too envious, this was a bit more straightforward for the Rams Trust application, because they had all sorts of statements from the club themselves that the academy and the training facility were an integral part of the football club. This was an integral part of the community, and that was supported by the local authority, the planning inspector, etc. For the Blackburn Rovers application, the training ground isn't in the Blackburn local authority area, but significant parts of the Ribble Valley local authority area have a majority of residents who identify as Blackburn Rovers supporters. And the ACV over the football ground at Ewell Park showed the community value of the football club. We also stressed in the application the record of the academy in terms of the youth team successes, in terms of the development of talent that had made it into the first team and on into international football, the income generated by sales of players who had been developed by the academy, which for us was over £4 million per annum over a 10-year period. We stressed the importance of the Category 1 academy status for the club. We found statements from players on how important the quality of the training facilities were in their decision to move and join the club. We looked at the role in relation to the development of our successful teams in relation to women's football, and we used the successful Rams Trust application as a precedent. In relation to examples of direct use by the community, again, there was a lot of good stuff in the Rams Trust application for Derby County, because the football club had made some unilateral undertakings under the Town and Country Planning Acts on educational use of the ground by local schools, on access to the medical facilities and physiotherapy facilities by local sports people, on community access for educational use, and that was an important part of the planning inspector's report. For us, Rovers Trust, again, we really stressed the community outreach programs, the use by the football club's community trust. There was an arrangement with a local school that was linked to a qualification on BTEC in sport. They had coaching camps for children. There were open events. The academy games that were held at the training ground were open to spectators, and regularly there would be 40 to 50 spectators attending. So it's really important, if you are going to make one of these applications, to gather as broad a range of examples of direct community use as possible. The legal test for listing a property as an ACV states that any community use must not be an ancillary use. Ancillary meaning secondary or non-primary, although its definition and interpretation isn't given by the Act itself. The main use for a football training ground is obviously going to be to provide training facilities for the football teams. They're very often closed facilities. They're very often behind fences and barriers. Very often the public is excluded whilst things are being worked out on the training ground. In the case of Blackburn Rovers, all that was true. There's a big physical barrier at the entrance to the training ground, which itself is in the middle of a village gated community. So this requirement that the community benefit is not an ancillary use is potentially problematic. The Derby County application had quite a subtle argument in relation to this. They'd looked at some dictionary definitions of this term ancillary, and they found a definition of ancillary as providing support to the central service. Okay, providing support to the central service. And they argued that the community and education uses of the training ground were not a support service. Essentially what they were doing was defining the community use as a shared use of the training ground that went alongside the primary use as a training facility. And at Blackburn Rovers we took that idea and we reinforced it with legal opinion from the leading authority on ACVs, who's a barrister called Christopher Kant. We argued that the community use doesn't have to be the primary use, that it can be an additional or complementary use. So we did take what had been part of a successful application, and we did reinforce it with legal opinion from the leading authority. But this was one of the grounds upon which our application was rejected. And essentially what happened was that the club brought in a national, indeed a global law firm, and they got their property law specialist really to push back very hard in relation to our application. And there's a technical legal point here, but I think that's probably the most important thing. The extent to which the club is going to really push back on the application is probably the strongest indicator as to whether the application will be successful or not. The law firm who Blackburn Rovers brought in argued that the training facility was essentially a private property from which the public were largely excluded. They argued that this particular ground wasn't an integral part of the football club, that these training facilities could be provided elsewhere, which is questionable to my mind, but also that any community use, the rather limited community use of the Brockall training ground, was ancillary to its main use. And that was an argument that was accepted by the local authority in our case. My summary on this particular point is to follow the line of argument that was laid out by the Rams Trust, which we also followed, but not to make it a high profile part of the application. Okay, so give some mention to this ancillary use, but don't flag it up yourself as a potentially problematic part of the application. So as a supporters trust, what are the potential benefits of making a training ground ACV application? Well, first and foremost, it might be successful. As far as we know, there have only been 2 applications so far, and they have a 50% strike rate. But even if your application is unsuccessful, I would argue that it's still something that you should consider doing. It puts the club on notice that the assets are being carefully looked at, certainly in our case, when for most of the past 8 years we've been in a non-cooperative, go as far as saying kind of hostile relationship with the club. It showed the owners that as a supporters trust we were watching the stewardship of the assets very, very carefully indeed. There's no sort of causal link I'm making here, but there was certainly no sort of damage to that relationship or to the status of the academy. The club publicly committed to continuing support for the training ground and academy, including the unusual step of retaining Category 1 academy status whilst we've been in League One. Secondly, the research that you do in relation to the training ground may uncover other useful restrictions on uses of that ground in planning or property law. So in our case, we found that there were a number of restrictive covenants in the lease that limited use of the property to sporting purposes. The key most valuable alternative use for this sort of land is very often housing. And in our case, that use was excluded by those covenants. We have members who are landowners in the village and therefore beneficiaries of any covenants. In other words, we are in a position to be able to enforce those covenants. Restrictive covenants aren't absolutely absolute. They can be discharged by a court, but it's a rather difficult thing to do. The land could be sold for a similar use, so it's not absolute, but this is potentially a much stronger limit, much stronger protection on the training ground than the ACV itself could have provided, and we've publicised that, which in itself is of value. We looked at the planning position of our training ground. Planning, of course, is much more fluid, but there can be strong barriers to change of use. In particular, a move from a sporting use to housing. We were able to find out that the centrally imposed targets for new build housing had already been allocated for the village in which the training ground is located, and therefore there's very, very little prospect of further housing approval under the current plan, which goes to 2025. And the final point really is that it shows supporter engagement. It shows engagement with our members. That as Supporters Trust, we are working in the long-term interests of supporters and the club itself. As organisations, obviously, we're devoted to obtaining ownership or part ownership or some other role in decision making at our clubs, most of whom don't have current owners who are ready or willing to sell to us anytime soon. So this does raise questions of how supporters' trusts stay relevant to their members whilst we're all playing this long game. There are lots of different ways of doing this, obviously, from lobbying for regulatory change right down to liaising at a ground level on issues like away travel, catering, ticket prices, etc. I just argue in this presentation that this sort of application is one way, even if it's unsuccessful, of showing supporters that as Supporters Trusts, we are carrying out our mission. And the final slide is just a list of further resources. I've kept this fairly short and sweet. So the My Community link takes you to a general background and guidance on what ACVs are for and how to make a bid. In relation to as a Supporters Trust, the second link is probably the most important. It'll take you through to the Supporters Direct resources on assets of community value in football. And the final link is to someone I mentioned earlier, Christopher Cant, who's a QC and who's the country's leading legal authority on assets of community value, and is very helpfully written a guide which is now in its 5th edition. It's very detailed, it's quite legalistic, but it will give you lots of further detail which may be relevant to the particular circumstances of your application. So thanks for listening. I hope you found it useful. If you've got any further questions, then please get in touch with the Supporters Direct, and they'll help you as much as they can, as will I. Thanks.